Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to call the special call meeting study session COVID-19 to order. It's April 27th and it is approximately 5:01. At this time, I will turn this over to Dr. Royster.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
As well. Good
Dr.
evening.
Royster, before we get started, we will keep this meeting 1 hour, not to exceed 1 hour. If we finished earlier, that's fine, but it will not exceed until 6 o'clock. Okay? Just want you to know.
I need to take some pages out.
Yes, sir. I guess you do.
My part will not be that long, I don't believe.
All right, sir.
We were asked to provide an update on COVID, where we are, what we're doing. So we will go through this as quickly as possible, and not wanting to move so fast that people not following or not understanding. But I think some of it are things you're familiar with seeing. Our incident rate. We have experienced for the last several weeks a phenomenon, at least for us during COVID, that is the incidence rate inside the district over 2-week periods. And you see that going back to March the 10th, both the attack rate and the risk ratio inside Greenville County Schools, which is represented by the yellow column or the first column to your left, has not compared favorably with the incidence rate outside Greenville County Schools. County as a whole, the green column or the second or center column, and the state rate is the far right column. We are trending in the right direction, but not as rapidly as the county or the state. In a minute, you will see a couple of the reasons we believe that's the case. Our attack rate inside the system is 0.0024 compared to 0.002 and 0.0015 in the county and in the state. Our risk ratio versus the county is 1.16. So you have a slightly higher risk inside the system than in the county, and versus the state is 1.6, almost 1.6 times the rate compared to the state. Many counties in the state, however, are at a low rate of spread. From March to the present, our risk ratios are the highest they have been since the beginning of the school year. These, we believe, are the two primary reasons for that. The effect of vaccinations in older populations, that is, people out in the county and in the state receiving because they're eligible for vaccines at a time when our students actually are not eligible. In fact, only now are those over 16 eligible, and there is no vaccine for under 16. So we're dealing with a higher percentage of total population in the county and the state eligible for vaccines than within our system. Within our system, you're talking about around 73,000 students, only a small number of whom are actually eligible. At the same time, our internal incidence rate has been lower than at any time since November, although it did increase following spring break. A trend that we have seen throughout this process. When we're in school, spread is lower than when we're out of school. That's been true throughout. The difference was not near as great as it was Christmas break. Students are now the primary driver of our internal numbers. Student exposures and infections as a percentage of the GCS total reflected 80% from August to January 8th through March 31st, 85%, and April 1 to the 26th, 89%. And our population the population we calculate this on is 87% students, 13% employees. Daily numbers of new isolations among employees has been, with 2 exceptions, less than 10 since mid-February and continued to decline. New daily employee quarantine numbers have mostly dropped into the single digit. Student isolations have increased following spring break, and daily new student quarantines have generally remained within the 20 to 80 range during March. The implementation of the joint resolution. Impact on high schools. Brick and mortar students must continue to attend in person on their assigned days as under the 75% attendance plan. So you got to show up on all those days that you're assigned. Students, or properly their parents, have the option to attend in person or log in for e-learning the other 25% of their school days. So that remains a parent's option if they want them to come and be there 100% of the time. Virtual program students placed not by choice can attend in person with their current teachers, minimal impact on high school classroom capacity. One of the key differences in high school, middle, and elementary that you will recall is at the high school level, a teacher teaches, for the most part, a mix of classes. Not a mix within the same class, but a mix of classes, i.e. first period, they may be teaching full in person. Second period, they may be teaching virtual students. So if a student transfers back into in-person attendance, they can retain that same teacher. They don't have to get a different teacher. With a very few exceptions, because we have a very small number of teachers teaching high school 100% virtually from a location other than school due to health issues. Now, at elementary and middle schools, that is not the case. We dedicated teachers to elementary virtual and middle school virtual. So if a parent chooses to bring their child to in-person, they were sent to virtual without choice, and they choose to bring them to in-person. At the middle school, that means they will get 7 new teachers. The elementary school, they will have a change in their primary teacher, and of course, their related arts teachers, but less academic impact. But they will have to change teachers because we don't have teachers that cross over. So provided that option, there were 1,424 students in the district that were placed in the virtual program, and they had no choice about that. They came into the district after the school year and they wanted a space at their new school. 740 opted to return. You see the number that declined and the number that they just didn't respond. We contacted all of them and made multiple attempts to contact them. The highest number returning to a single school is 28. The highest number returning to a single grade at one school is 11. And all of those returned this week. Maintenance of current protocols. Mask and distancing remain key recommendations of public health authorities and medical experts, including CDC, DHEC, Bon Secours St. Francis, PRISMA, and MUSC. Updated CDC guidance calls for universal masking indoors of students ages 5 and up. However, we continue to follow DHEC protocols in that regard. Masking is a requirement of the South Carolina Department of Education for school districts reopening and operational plans for this school year. You'll see this in quotes. Students and staff in South Carolina Public Schools must wear a face covering upon entering a school building, moving through hallways, during carpool bus drop-off or pickup, and when social distancing is not possible or optimal. Student face coverings may be removed upon teacher administrator direction while in the classroom or during special activities outside the classroom. That was authorized in State Board of Education Health and Safety of Students policy passed August 11th, 2020, and you see a link there citing that. The State Department of Education statement regarding this issued today. Correct and universal wearing of face masks has been a key mitigation strategy that has allowed schools in South Carolina to fully reopen, while those in the majority of states throughout the nation remain on hybrid or fully virtual schedules. We have provided teachers, schools, and districts flexibility in implementing this policy so that it best fits the needs of the local community by allowing face coverings to be removed upon teacher or administrator direction while in the classroom or during special activities outside the classroom. We've also allowed for special considerations and exemptions for our youngest learners, those who have trouble breathing, those with special health care educational needs. The current policy will remain in place for the remainder of the 2021 school year. As we anticipate COVID-19 vaccines becoming available for the majority of school-age population over the summer, Superintendent Spearman will move for the current policy to become a recommendation rather than a requirement at the conclusion of this school year, as students will have been afforded the same virus protections adults currently enjoy. That is directly from Ryan Brown, the Chief Communications Officer, State Department of Education. Hopefully, they know something there that we're not yet aware of, because at this time, based on the research we've done and the information we have available, there is no vaccine currently approved in the United States for children ages 0 to 15. And although that statement refers to such, so hopefully they're going to provide some information to us that will cause us to believe that there is some vaccine out there we're not yet aware of. Updated CDC guidance allows for 3-foot distancing at the elementary level at all times, and at the secondary level when community incidence is not defined as high. The community incidence is high, guidance is for secondary students to maintain 6 feet. We are unable to follow that guidance because in our state, our legislature has taken an action requiring students to be able to be in attendance 100% of the time at the high school level. We cannot have them in the room 100% of the time and maintain 6 feet. We're doing that where we can. But there are other places where we have dropped back to the updated guidance, although we are not yet at a community incidence level less than high. We're approaching that. We hope that we soon reach that. But we have to comply with the law, and we're trying to balance that compliance with the law against the recommendations from the CDC and other healthcare providers. Questions occur about plexiglass. This is the CDC's clarification on that. Evidence for other mitigation measures, such as mask, distancing, hand hygiene, and ventilation, are stronger and should be prioritized. It is important to clarify that CDC is not recommending against the use of physical barriers, and if schools have been using them and finding them to be useful in reducing transmission, they may consider continuing to do so. Here's one of the primary reasons for continuing to do so. DHEC quarantine requirements are unchanged. Quarantine requirements are that. They are requirements, not recommendations. Any person spending a cumulative 15 minutes within 6 feet, 15 minutes or more, within 6 feet of a COVID positive individual, with or without a mask, is required to quarantine. DHEC exception for plexiglass mask and 3-foot distance combination remains in effect. So that drops in DHEC's eyes their requirement from that 6-foot radius to 3 feet, and inside that plexiglass, if they had their mask on, there is no need for anyone else to quarantine besides the individual that tested positive. In the other scenario, anybody within 6 feet of that person more than 15 minutes will be required to quarantine. And we do have parents that express concerns about the increased risk of quarantine, missing school and extracurricular activities, including requests that students participating in athletics not be required to attend school at all, even though they chose brick and mortar. We have not approved any of those requests. Retaining plexiglass pods when possible through the end of school year will minimize quarantines. Graduation, the end of the year recognitions. The class of 2021 ceremonies, which you already have a schedule for those, will be June 1 to 4. We must follow all of Bon Secours protocols. We're using their facility. We have a contract with them to do so, and they set out certain parameters with which we must follow. Depending on the school, going back to item 1, graduates are being allocated 4, 6, or 8 guest tickets based on class size. Class size obviously being the graduating class size. Right now, there is only one school limited to 4. We have had numerous discussions with Bon Secours, asking them to give consideration to the fact that we're talking about a group of students that for the last month of school will be seated within 3 feet of each other in their classrooms wearing a mask. And would they accept that 3-foot distancing on the floor only, at Bon Secours and in the student seating, the graduating student seating sections, so as to fix that disparity where it would be either 6 or 8 for every school. They have declined to do so. It's like their own protocols they have, and they're following those with everyone that utilizes that facility, which would be the Clemson ring ceremony, Clemson graduation. I don't know the other school. There are some other school districts that are graduating there. I'm not sure which ones. They're applying that to all of those entities. We've had a question about Furman. Furman's not opened to outside groups at all this year, and the seating capacity inside Timmons, it wouldn't accommodate our largest schools already. And in fact, the larger schools that graduate at Timmons now cap the number of tickets they're for guests. So having a limited number of tickets is not new for some of our schools. It's new for, well, it'll be the second year, because last year everybody was capped at 2. So it is not new for others. End of the year celebrations, each school has worked with student leadership to plan events. And we're talking here primarily about high school, but we have these kinds of events on a more limited basis at middle and elementary schools. Each school worked with student leadership to plan events, which have included spirit weeks, in-person senior nights and senior celebrations, other formal events, including proms with protocols in place, and both virtual and in-person award ceremonies. And that concludes the formal part of my report. I'll be glad to answer any questions you have, and also have Mr. Reimer here to further elaborate on things related to high school if you desire greater detail than that which I shared.
Okay, so basically, Dr. Royster, you covered 1.01, return to school this semester, compliance with the action of the General Assembly. Number 1.02, current status of COVID-19 in the district. And then you finished with 1.83, graduation ceremony.
Yes, ma'am.
At this time, we will take questions. Do you have any questions? Mr. Lewis.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Royster. This is good information. There are a couple of things that I'm not entirely clear on, so if we could maybe just talk through a few of them. So since we're on the slide with year-end recognitions, so there are schools in Greenville County that are going to have proms this year that are sanctioned by Greenville County Schools?
That is correct. Mr. Reimer?
Yes, that is correct.
How many?
Some schools would call them proms because they're trying to replicate as best as possible based on protocols what a typical prom would be. Some, when they met with their student leadership, decided to have other types of celebrations, red carpet affairs, kind of like the Oscars. One school's doing the Oscars. So it's a variety of things based upon what their student leadership and their students said that they wanted to do, understanding the protocols. If we did a quote unquote prom, what would be allowed and what wouldn't be.
Of all of our high schools, how many of them are having a prom?
With the word prom, very few. Most, and I can look that up specifically, but most are calling it senior celebrations.
And you're saying that the I'm sorry, you counting? Okay.
Search shows 2.
Okay.
Using the word prom in there.
Okay. And you're saying that the principal met with the student leadership. You're talking about the student body officers that were elected. Is that who?
Seniors and other students.
Okay. And so the decisions made at a school by school basis were those kind of reached by the administration of that school and these seniors and other students that are officers.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. Can we? So at the high school level, we had students with plexiglass and masks. The General Assembly changed the rules for us midweek, and now we've got everybody back, and we've removed the plexiglass from all of our high schools, correct?
We removed the plexiglass in almost every location in the high school. Some places principals wanted to leave it in place because they could better configure a class using it.
Okay.
But in general terms, we moved several thousand, Philip.
Overall, it would have been at the high school level, there were roughly 1,200 classrooms total at the high school,
1,200 classrooms,
at the high school
to
level.
which we moved several thousand
Correct.
desks so that they can sit in a row front to back. And if you look at all the CDC guidance, all the various diagrams they give, all of them where people, unless they're seated front to back, they have some sort of barrier. In other words, they don't want people, their guidance, they do not recommend or desire that people be face to face unless they're 6 feet apart.
Okay.
So we took and changed out all the furniture so they could sit where it minimizes their exposure. You got on a mask, the person in front of you, you are facing their back. And you are 3 feet from them and at least 3 feet from the people beside you.
Okay. So
Narrows that area of quarantine, generally speaking, you're sitting in the middle of the room, to somewhere between 4 and 8 more people.
So a month ago, before we removed the plexiglass and we reconfigured the classrooms, if somebody in that classroom was tested positive, because of the protocols we had in place, everyone in the classroom didn't have to isolate,
No.
correct? Because we had plexiglass and masks.
In fact, it was most likely that only the person who tested positive had to isolate or quarantine.
Okay.
They had to isolate if they're positive, and if you were exposed to them, you had to quarantine.
And now that we've made these changes in that same classroom, somebody tests positive, who has to isolate or quarantine in that classroom now?
Anybody within 6 feet of that person.
Okay.
So now you've expanded it from likely no one to anywhere between probably 4 and 8 people.
So I guess this is because this is what I worry about now as we're approaching May, and one of the valedictorians lives on my street, and she came up to me and said, "So now you've taken the plexiglass away, and if I sit in a classroom as valedictorian, and someone in my class tests positive week after next, then I won't be able to speak at my high school graduation because I'll be required to be isolating because of a possible exposure in that classroom." Is that correct?
It is possible, dependent upon where that person is sitting, that they might have to quarantine, and they would not be able to deliver their valedictory or salutatory, I don't remember which example you used, address in person. We would certainly make arrangements for them to deliver it by video, but they would not be able to make it in person
So
if they fell within the right number of days.
but because of an exposure that happened as a result of us removing plexiglass, the same room where there wouldn't have been an exposure a month ago now is putting them in a different level of exposure than it would have a month prior.
Yes.
So what advice would you give the family? Because it seems to me the answer would be, well, then you should probably stop coming to school, because I'm afraid that we've put them now in a place where I can't say comfortably that the protocols we've put in place are going to protect them from exposure in the same way that they did a month ago. And so if it's important for you for that student to be able to speak at graduation, then the best way to reduce that risk would be to stay home.
The first thing I would suggest to that parent and to that student is to talk with the principal of the school and see if they might position them in their class the best way possible to try to limit that circumstance. But I would be hesitant to tell somebody their child needs to stay at home, because there's certain things they're going to have to come and do, like final exams, and they may be taking an AP course and have to take AP exams. You don't have any seniors taking end of course. It's an unfortunate circumstance, but it is a circumstance beyond our control. We didn't make that decision to immediately require 100% or offer 100% in person. And the only way we could accommodate it because of class sizes at the high school level was to change out those configurations.
The last question I have is just a question about the school year. So I think in the information you shared from the State Department of Education, so now the position Superintendent Spearman has taken is that masks are currently mandated and that the plan is to transition from a mandate to a recommendation for masks at the end of this school year?
That is my understanding based on the communication we received from them today. Which is right there with that qualifier on it, which I haven't had time to follow up with her. I talked with her yesterday. I talked with Superintendent yesterday. She only talked about the part where it's in place for the current year. We followed up on that this morning. Got this statement from Ryan Brown. My question about this is, to what vaccine is Superintendent Spearman referencing? Because to our knowledge right now, there is not one for students age 0 to 15. There's a Pfizer vaccine that on April 9th, they had requested FDA permission to allow adolescents to receive the shots after a trial of the vaccine in that age group showed it was safe and effective. It hopes the FDA will clear their shots for adolescents, quote, before the start of the next school year, unquote. And then there is nothing for on the docket for the start of the year. Pfizer goes on to say that they expect in the second half of 21 that could allow some trials they've done that could allow for vaccination, again, by choice, for children under that age in the second half of 21, but it offers no date. So that's the only information we have. So I'm interested to find out what additional information perhaps they have at the State Department that we're not aware of.
Do we interpret her definition of the end of the school year to be the last day of school this spring? Or do we interpret that there will still be a mask requirement going all the way through our summer programming, and that the end of the school year, beginning of next school year is actually when the mask requirement will be changed from a requirement to recommendation?
All of our summer academic programs are an extension of this school year, so we would carry that forward during the summer.
So we interpret the end of the school year to be all the way through summer.
Right, until the beginning of the following school year.
New school year is the next day, the day that we start school the next year. Okay, thank you.
Is that all? Mr. Lewis? Okay. Ms. Mosley?
Thank you. I have several questions. First of all, I spoke with Mr. Brown today myself, and just to clarify, because I asked him that exact question, Derek, of how they define the end of school year. I was told by him that it would be the last day of school for this year per district, because everybody has a little different end date. So for us, I guess that's June. I interpreted that as June 4th. So are you interpreting it differently, or is that what they've communicated to you? Because that what was communicated to me today by Ryan Brown is different than what you just said.
What I provided Mr. Lewis was my interpretation. I've heard no interpretation from Mr. Brown. Well, all we have from Mr. Brown is what we have up there. And I don't know that would cause us to change what we do going into the summer. No matter what their interpretation might be, I believe at this point, it's prudent for us to continue the protocols we have in place, at least for the summer.
Okay, so just for clarification, for students who are coming into the building for remediation purposes, you're indicating that they will be distanced and masked and other cleaning protocols in place, et cetera, that we've been doing?
Yes.
Okay.
Unless there's some change to that from the people that give us advice and information about it.
Okay, so, and I'm a little confused between, my next question goes to what CDC has said versus what DHEC has said, because, and it's two questions, but they're related. In your presentation on one of the pages, you said something about the CDC recommending that children 5 and up be masked, but that we are following DHEC recommendations. What are we following? I'm confused.
We have in our plan, which we developed with the input from Prisma, Bon Secours, St. Francis, MUSC, and DHEC, we have consistently stuck with, if you can maintain a social distance of 6 feet, you do not have to be masked.
Regardless of age?
We've used that. We actually have used that regardless of age.
Okay. Okay. So then the second question I have goes to the CDC's recent change to the 3 feet, which of course I know you've set the classrooms up to accommodate that as best you can. Does the CDC, and this kind of ties in with the quarantine question, does the CDC recommend 3 feet? Are they still recommending 6 feet in quarantine, or are they down to 3 feet in quarantine? I guess I'm trying to understand why I'm also trying to understand if the CDC is also has publicly said that there's no evidence that the plexiglass is effective. So therefore it really wasn't protecting us within our configurations. Why are we holding ourselves to this quarantine rule that says we now have to quarantine because we have no plexiglass to protect us, if it wasn't protecting us to begin with? I guess I'm just trying to understand.
You
that
make
seems
an
to be a disconnect
assumption.
with me.
You make an assumption that CDC has clarified for us, and we contacted them to see exactly what they were saying. Schools have been using it, finding them to be useful in reducing transmission. And we have a number of studies now that seem to indicate that along with all these other measures are helpful. They're useful, including the report that was presented by Dr. Eckert from MUSC. And I believe there's a North Carolina study, and there's a fairly extensive Florida study, all of which support that this combination of mitigation efforts is effective. One of the problems is there's no way to separate it out. You cannot separate out that this one's effective, that one's effective, that one's not effective, because they're used in unison. But the places where studies have been done, and those are the largest ones, North Carolina, MUSC, and Florida, indicate these combinations of things are effective. So that's why we asked CDC to clarify, and they said if it's useful, you may consider continuing to do so. Now, what we need to make really, really very clear to make sure everyone understands, DHEC quarantine is not a recommendation. It is not a guideline. It is a requirement. They make the determination in infectious disease if a quarantine is required, and they communicate that decision that if you meet these parameters, then you must quarantine. So that's not something where we can choose someone else's guidance. We have to follow their requirement. So when we increase the number of people within that area of potential exposure, we got to follow their 6 feet instead of, they said 3 feet with that barrier and a mask, they would not require quarantine. So we follow their requirements. There's not some other entity we can choose to follow in that respect or in that regard.
So DHEC is not recommending what the CDC recommended. They haven't gone from 6 feet to 3 feet in their recommendations. DHEC is still sticking to the 6 feet. Is that what?
DHEC is still recommending 6 feet or these barriers and 3 feet. Configured in the way in which either we submitted or other school districts have submitted similar or in fact, some of them have submitted the same thing we did because they used ours. So that they have approved that for their definition of required quarantine, that utilizing a barrier, masking 3 feet between the people inside the barrier and 6 feet between one set of barriers and the next limits quarantine exposure. And in fact, if you do all the things they said to do, the only person that has to stay at home is the person who tests positive.
Okay, so can we go back? I'm sorry, we don't have a copy of this presentation, right? Is it on board? Okay, for whatever reason, it wasn't showing up for me. Can we go back to the slide about, I think it was the masking protocols, say, where we were, let me see, sorry.
That's all right.
Basically, I wrote down, it said, you said that there were, student face coverings may be removed upon teacher or administrator direction while in the classroom or during special activities outside the classroom. Are we allowing that? Because I'm hearing that, at least for my own children, that they're in a mask all day, including PE, walking around outside a track. So I'm trying to understand if
We have
that's
stuck
something we're doing.
with 6 feet or wearing a mask.
Okay, so that
Now,
sentence,
we have some exceptions that were approved in our plan early on from the state. In fact, initially, remember, this goes back to August the 11th. They were requiring it for every student, no matter what age and no matter whether you had distancing or not. And we never required it of our youngest students until we had to do so when we put more people in the room and we couldn't maintain the 6 feet. But we got that approved as part of our reopening plan that they approved. They agreed to it.
okay, so that last statement that student face coverings may be removed upon teacher or administrator direction while in classroom or during special activities is, it says it's part of our current protocols, but it's really not. I mean, I'm just, because I don't think it's
It's not
happening.
as liberally as you might read that. You got a student standing up at the front, they're 6 feet away from other people, they're doing a report, you can take your mask off. We've allowed those kinds of things. We've tried to very diligently follow the protocols we have in place, and I think that's one of the reasons we've had such low incidence rates. And we have to remember that we're talking about, in our system, if we're only talking about teachers giving direction, we're talking about the potential for people to get nearly 6,000 individual directions. So we've tried to be very consistent throughout the system.
Okay, so unless we're within 6 feet, we are not allowing teachers or administrators to allow students to take their mask off.
They take it off to eat. They take it off during certain athletic events. We've got protocols in place for those things. Some of the things Mr. Reimer mentioned, they can remove their mask in the group they came with to some of those events. Isn't that right, Mr. Reimer?
Yes, what we decided, and with the guidance of Ms. Loggy and her staff, is that in celebrations, senior nights, senior celebrations, we would allow up to 8 students in a pod. And those students who came together and were podded together could remove the masks in that pod, but pod A could not mingle with pod B.
Okay.
To
Because
minimize.
again, we're talking about the difference between a voluntary activity and parents being aware of what rules are in place as opposed to students who are compelled to be there during the school day.
Okay, so I'm sorry, I'm jumping all around. Going back to the statement where you were questioning whether student vaccines could potentially become available, are we moving the goalpost again as terms of what we're waiting on to return to normalcy, in the sense of if Superintendent Spearman comes out, well, clearly she has, and says that they are going to be removing I wrote down Mr. Brown's exact quote to me today on the phone was, the South Carolina Department of Education has no plans to require mitigation measures after the end of the current school year. It will be left up to the local leadership to decide going forward.
Mhm.
So in the context of that statement, are we now suggesting, because I remember us saying that once the teacher vaccines are available, then that's a little bit of a game changer. Are we now suggesting that the goalposts are moving again to where we're waiting for student vaccines to be developed before we?
Well, I'm
consider
as confused,
changes?
I'm as confused by this as you are. Because in one sentence, she says, gonna do it, and then it says because of this, but we're not aware that there is a vaccine. She seems to be conditioning that we're gonna remove that because any student that wants a vaccine would be able to have one. So I find that confusing as well.
Okay, so this is maybe a question we need to go back and
We're gonna go back, yeah.
get that. Okay. All right, so I'm going back to probably the beginning where we were talking about, or the section about the new high school plan, or I mean, the resolution that came out. I understand that virtual students who moved into the district are now allowed to attend.
Mhm.
For the virtual students that chose the virtual school, and I've received a lot of emails because there was some confusion about that. Have we accounted for like students that are really struggling virtually and allowed them back into the brick and mortar setting, especially under this new resolution, like anyone that's expressed concern about, I mean, I know we addressed some early back when we went to 75%, but have we taken that any further?
Yes, to your point, we have allowed some students back in space available throughout the course of the year.
Right,
From virtual to brick and mortar, not just at the high school level, at other levels.
okay,
We did not, we still have, here somewhere. We have we put them on a wait list if you ask to do that. We right now have 2,400 on that wait list. 517 of them are at the high school. That's not really an issue because there's a high school teacher sitting there that is using a classroom for the most part, that period to teach those students. So they're sitting in an empty classroom. Now the ratio in virtual school is much higher than in regular school. So if all 35 of them or 36 of them chose to come back, they probably would have trouble fitting in the room. But they're really not the issue because they'd have the same teacher just sitting in a room, but they'd be taught. I mean, they'd just be sitting there listening to the same thing the teacher's saying to the ones that are still virtual. The problem is with elementary and middle school. So when you look at where we are right now, we have about 20 days left at elementary and middle school. 20 full days and 2 half days. In particular, if we're talking about students that are struggling. Those elementary students would go to a different teacher. A teacher they've not been with, not seen, not had all year. A middle school student would get 7 new teachers because those teachers that are currently teaching them are assigned to virtual. When they're teaching virtually, they have a virtual student load. Again, one that greatly exceeds the classroom load. So we're going to bring them in there the last month of school. We've got the same supports available to them, though they're virtual or remote, virtually as we have in the building. It would seem a lesser academic decision to put them with a new teacher with 20 days left in school than for them to continue where they are. We're also looking at how many students would that put in that teacher's room that's been, maybe they're teaching 24, 25 already. How many will that add to their load? So when we look at all that, while we certainly complying with what we believe the interpretation of the act is, that these people had no choice that got sent to virtual. We let them come in, and again, I think it was about a third of them came in. But there seems to be little benefit to bringing these students in with, again, 20 days left in school and to create this disruption in their whole academic schedule. That's a disruption most families and most schools don't like to do at 3 weeks after school starts. When we sometimes have to add a teacher to drop class sizes. So a lot of parents don't want to move their child the second or third week of school. If they're not doing well, I'm not sure that 20 days in person is going to make a big difference in how they're doing. And as soon as the school year's out, we'll have them in there in person during the remediation that we need to do with them over the summer.
Anything else? Ms. Mosley?
Yes. Do you know when you will be bringing a recommendation to us regarding next school year?
I don't know at this time. The further out that we try to make a decision or take an action or make a recommendation, the greater the likelihood it may be wrong and they'll have to be changed. Of all the things people don't like about whatever it is we might have done or not done, the thing they like the least is when changes have to be made. We've set up our enrollment for virtual so that we can easily transition people all the way through June the 15th, and we can transition them all the way up to July the 15th. We've staffed the schools in such a way by not reducing the teaching staffs to accept a return of almost all the students they have had. I think the lowest number we prepared for is 80%, Bill. So 80% or better return to every school. Again, we didn't reduce that staff. We staffed virtual to the level we believe we can take the ones that have already signed up for it and accommodate any that might sign up in the future, although we may have to move some personnel in there. And it just depends on what information we get. And this seems to change daily, just like first time I've heard was today that we're thinking about dropping that because there's going to be vaccine for students. So sooner the better, as far as I'm concerned.
So it sounds like we're basing decisions on whether or not students are vaccinated or not. Or if there's a vaccine available.
No, that was what the State Department put out there. The reason we're saying this is because there's going to be this availability of vaccines.
So for you, this is my last question for you. In your opinion, or whatever, in your mind, at what point does the burden shift back to the individual?
When we believe that we're doing all those things that a reasonable person would do based on the advice that we get from experts, realizing that some people have real choices and other people don't have such real choices, and that we've done, again, what a reasonable person would do based on the advice of medical and health experts to safeguard our employees and our students, realizing again that some of them have more choice than others do.
Is that it? Thank you, Ms. Mosley. Ms. Doolin? Yes, ma'am.
I was taking notes while Angie was speaking, so I might be slightly redundant, but are you saying that the new Department of Education statement that came out today is not going to change anything that you have planned for summer?
Regarding plans for summer
School.
I do not see anything that would cause us at this point to change what we're going to do for the summer.
I saw on the on DHEC's website that Greenville County is now considered moderate for the incidence rate and not high. So does that change?
I don't believe that was the status at the last 2-week interval.
That's what it is today.
Ms. Fitzer, she tracks that for us.
Does that change any protocols when we fall into the moderate?
All that does is make us actually eligible to do what we're having to do already. But would you speak to the question?
Yes, sir.
Is this on?
The last 2 week report that came out, our incidence level was still high. We were overall at a medium, so the 3 metrics averaged out to medium. But the incidence rate per 100,000 is still high, but just on the board. So if you look on the DHEC website, it'll redo that 2 weeks every day, so it may not drop today.
Well, when I looked today, it said we were moderate.
So, yeah, so we've been going by these weekly Thursday reports.
Hmm.
So it is possible that today we have dropped because we were at 203.8 as of Thursday. And the cutoff for medium is 200.
And really all that does is say that we're now in line with what the CDC says we've already done, because we had to do it to get high school students back in 100% of the time.
I'm glad to hear Mr. Lewis's question about his neighbor being the valedictorian, because I had that concern also. And I'm disappointed to hear that the plan is to just keep the valedictorian at home if she needs to be quarantined. Would you be more comfortable, since that is you say that's a requirement for quarantining?
I'm
If
sorry, I
someone-
didn't understand the first part of what you
If
said.
someone is exposed in the classroom, it's a requirement that they quarantine.
Yes, that's correct.
Would you be more comfortable ignoring that requirement if the board took responsibility for granting permission for a valedictorian to attend graduation?
I would never advise you to ignore a requirement of the public health authority in this state.
Or if some of Mr. Meek's students at Carolina have their signature on their graduation gown and then they are not allowed to attend even if they're healthy?
I cannot in good conscience advise you not to follow what has the effect of law in the state of South Carolina.
But the seating arrangement is what you've said is 6 feet apart and a mask on at graduation. So even if someone didn't have a fever and was otherwise healthy, but had maybe been exposed, it doesn't seem fair to make them miss their
Well,
graduation.
Ms. Dillon, I don't disagree with you that it may not seem fair. It may not be fair. It is a requirement.
You don't feel like we could, as a panel, vote to ignore that?
Do not recommend that you ever vote to do something that violates a state law or
Not a
state
state law.
regulation. It has the
The
effect.
the legislation has not passed that and it's not a law. And you know who told me that was Ryan Brown when I spoke to
Yeah.
him last week.
It has the effect of law because it is a requirement pursuant to a statutory authority designated to the Department of Health and Environmental Control. And I would not advise to you or to the board in general that you take an action contrary to that.
I was told something different by Mr. Brown.
Mr.
He
Brown's not the
also-
one that would be held accountable for it.
No, and that's why I asked if you'd be more comfortable letting the board do that, because I think some of us wouldn't mind being accountable. That would take the
Well-
responsibility off you.
Ms. Doolin, this is information only, so there would be no action taken.
No, I understand that.
Will you continue your
Mhm.
questions?
Mr. Brown also did tell me that he felt the interpretation from the Department of Education was that the school year ended in June and that Molly Spearman's recommendations for this school year would end on the last day of school in June, and that local districts would need to decide what they would do over the summer and next year. Just to clarify, since that came up before. My only other question was, what is happening with all the plexiglass that was removed from the high schools?
Right now, it's simply being stored.
Is there a plan of what to do with it?
When we've determined there no longer be a need for it, yes, we've been given permission from State Department of Education to dispose of it and to retain any earnings that we may garner from the disposal.
You mean by disposal, selling it or recycling
Yes.
it?
However we choose to dispose of it,
Is there anyone lined up to buy it?
yes.
Oh, okay. My other questions may be answered in executive session because they're legal questions for Doug.
Okay.
So, thank you.
Thank you. And Dr. Stiles, you will be our last person.
Dr. Royster, like you and some of our other board members, I'm a little confused about this statement from Superintendent Spearman regarding changing from a requirement at the conclusion of this school year based on a vaccine for children. I just had a question. Do you have access to Molly Spearman where you can call her as a school superintendent? Do you have readily access to Mrs. Spearman?
Yes, I talked with her yesterday afternoon.
Would you be willing to get some clarification? I know that I would really like to know where she stands on this issue in regard to next year. Would that be a possibility that you could speak to her?
I'm eager to get clarification because I just don't quite honestly understand it. It seems to be a qualified statement and I don't understand it.
I don't know about the rest of the board, but that's something I would really like to obtain and understand. If that's a possibility, I would really appreciate it.
Certainly.
Thank you, Dr. Stiles. We have 2 minutes and Mr. Sutton, very quickly.
Who put this presentation together?
Ms. Fitzer and I,
Where did we get the data from?
sir,
Is that our data?
the data in the front, that comes from Dr. McCrary's office. Are you speaking about this data?
Oh, any data. If I will break this down slide by slide, I want to know what is ours, the school district.
Any data that's not footnoted came from us. It came from Dr. McCreary's office. So if there's something in there that has a footnote, it came from somewhere else. Anything else came from us, and any data that does not show a footnote, and I'm not sure there's any data in there with a footnote, any data came from Dr. McCreary's office. They calculate this for us, as you will see, on a 1-week interval. Every week they calculate it. You see the dates there to the left. All those are calculated by Dr. McCrary in his office.
They get that information from.
Where do they get the information from?
They're calculating.
They get the green column and the blue column, the county and the state from DHEC, and they get our interior numbers from our interior tracking, our internal tracking, and from it's confirmed by DHEC.
Author of this presentation is who?
Well, the whole thing is my responsibility. The data is done in Dr. McCrary's office.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, with that being said, thank you, Dr. Royster, and all board members for your questions. We conclude the special call meeting study session COVID-19 update. I appreciate the information and look forward to those questions that were asked that need reply. We are a motion to go out of executive. Without objection, we will go